because of the fact that over the years, quite a number of people, not only I, have begun with jokes, my repertoire of jokes sort of ran out. So I was forced to go to the source of all knowledge, namely the internet. And I found a few there when I sort of reworked. So start with the priest, imam, and rabbi who were decided to see which was the best converter who teaches religion. They decided that the job would be, their task would be to convert a bear. So they went into the forest. Sometime afterwards, they come out. The priest reports he was very successful. He had already baptized the bear, and the bear would have first communion the next week. And the imam came back. He said, "Very good. He got the bear to pronounce the Shahada, and that he soon would be able to pray the 5 times a day." And the rabbi was lying there on a stretcher in bandages. And they said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, I probably did it wrong, but I started with circumcision." This session will be devoted to conversion and construction of identity. The first speaker is Dr. Einat Libel-Hass, who's an anthropologist and historian. Her PhD dissertation topic is the development of liberal, reform, and conservative Judaism in Tel Aviv, organizational patterns and identities, which won the Cherkin Award for outstanding doctoral thesis. Dr. Libel-Hass is a lecturer at Ashkelon Academic College in Israel. Her academic interests include cultural dynamics between Israel and the U.S., liberal Judaism, and congregational studies. And her topic for today is a matter of conversion, reform, Jewish conversion in Israel as a process of constructing identity and belonging.
The presentation addressed reform Jewish conversion in Israel through the eyes of female immigrant converts. While Orthodox conversion encourages converts to conduct a religious way of life, its reform counterpart urges them to define their own personal connection and obligation to Jewish tradition. The State of Israel gave the Orthodox establishment monopoly on conducted conversions. However, it currently recognizes reform conversion for the purpose of being registered as a Jew in the population registry. In other words, this kind of conversion is considered legal by the state, but is not recognized by the Orthodox establishment. The literature sees conversion in Israel as a naturalization process, as well as a change of religion and identity. The data presented is part of an ethnographic field study that I have conducted for my doctoral dissertation in Beit Daniel, a Reform congregation located in Tel Aviv, the cultural center of Israel. 100 people convert to Judaism at Beit Daniel each year. 95% of them are women who immigrated to Israel from the former Soviet Union, Europe, and the Philippines. And in the picture you can see Beit Daniel, the entrance of it. Using Victor Turner's terminology, one can say that every kind of conversion is a liminal period. In this presentation, I will compare the liminality of the Jewish identity of women who completed a Reform conversion course. The women belong to 2 groups: Russian-speaking non-Jewish immigrants and former foreign workers from the Philippines. For this purpose, I will analyze the identity and belonging perceptions of women who completed the conversion studies at Beit Daniel, as well as their partners. Ostensibly, such women are considered to be socially marginalized and have a liminal identity because one characteristic of their identity pushed them to the margins of society. For women from the former Soviet Union, their characteristic is their patrilineal Jewish descent, since the father is Jewish while the mother is not. They are considered to be Jewish according to Jewish law. For Filipino women, it is their being Asian, and the initial circumstances of their arrival to Israel as foreign workers. Just one moment. I will contend that compared to the Russian-speaking women, whose origin and look is European, the Filipino women face heightened liminality during and following the conversion course because of their race, so their transitory liminal state become permanent. In addition, I would argue that the decision to become congregation members at the end of the conversion process is more of a group decision than an individual one. Evidence in support of this argument is the Filipinos and their husbands who formed a group of friends that encouraged them to stay in the congregation. To date, only one researcher by the name of Dvora Skortovskia has examined the ideological differences between Orthodoxy and Reform conversion, while Skortovskia focused solely on Russian-speaking converts. I will examine Filipino and their partners. And now to the former Soviet Union-born women converts. These converts are part of the non-Jewish population who immigrated to Israel from the former Soviet Union, primarily during the 1990s, estimated at 300,000 people. Having lived in Israel for 2 or 3 decades, they have, sociologically speaking, joined the Jewish people. The literature on immigration around the world indicates that the move to another country may trigger a return to religion and religious practices. Accordingly, one of the motivations behind turning to Reform conversion among Russian-speaking immigrants who came to Israel in adulthood is their rising interest in their Jewish identity. In an interview conducted with Lena, a 50-year-old educational psychologist who immigrated to Israel something like 15 years ago and is separated from her husband, she referred to her reasons to convert by saying, "I did the conversion for the soul. I did it only for myself. For me, the conversion is important for being whole. Conversion gives knowledge, history of the Jewish people. Why did I convert? Because I wanted to develop, to know more. Conversion is a soul work. What you think and feel you share with others around you." Her spiritual motivation for undergoing conversion is clearly demonstrated by her use of an expression implying spiritual growth and more about... She perceives conversion to be less about acquiring knowledge on Jewish history and more about being a spiritual learning process. Lena's words confirm Skortovskia's study findings since, like Lena, the Russian-speaking women who had undergone Reform conversion and were interviewed by her mentioned they preferred a conversion that is based on an intelligent person's ability to read ancient texts and draw spiritual lessons from them. For Lena, not only did the conclusion of the Reform conversion process mark her final integration into the Israeli society, but a religious transformation. Here you can see one couple of Filipino convert and her husband. Philippines-born women encounter many obstacles when attempting to get accepted to Orthodox conversion process because the establishment fears that as former foreign workers, they are merely using conversion studies to significantly shorten the waiting period required before they are eligible for Israeli citizenship. Some converts turn into congregation members, into Reform congregation members who frequently pray, also in due to the deep connection of religion that was rooted in them since childhood. Rina, you can see her in the picture. Rina, in her 40s, a housekeeper, recalls that she was raised as Christian and regularly frequented church. Today she says, "I come to Beit Daniel because I want to pray. I come from a spiritual need." The women mentioned their growing identification with Judaism and emphasizes that despite the fact that their formal conversion process has ended, they are still undergoing religious change. Rina say, "I am in a process, I'm learning, and I'm happy to learn more." But the marginal social status of Filipino converts, being former foreign workers of Asian descent who underwent conversion in a non-Orthodox alternative reform course, has led to a fuzzy, elusive, and hard-to-define identity. The temporary status of converts has turned, in the case of the Filipino women, into a fixed one, and no change is expected in the foreseeable future. I learned about it from comments made by several old-time congregation members who still refer to the converts as Filipino women whose number is growing in Beit Daniel. Most of the Filipino women's partners grew up in Orthodox religious families. If you remember Moshe in this picture, his family was a traditional Yemenite one. He married Rina, the Filipino woman I quoted before, and he told me, I came from the tradition. I received an Orthodox education. There was a phase that for many years I didn't go to synagogue. It was easy to move closer here in Beit Daniel to the tradition because Beit Daniel enabled me to study, to get to know another side of Judaism, to feel a greater sense of belonging. The synagogue allowed me to draw nearer to Judaism and feel more Jewish. Moshe emphasized, his family name is Chizmi, Moshe emphasized that the open and welcoming atmosphere of the Reform Conversion course allowed spouses to get closer to Judaism once more at their own pace. During the course, the couples meet each other and immediately see the similarities of their situation. Namely, that they are all coping with the intolerant reaction of the Israeli society to their intermarriage between them being Jewish and the women who were former foreign workers and are of different race and religion. This is attested by the following quoted by Hanoch. You can see him in the picture. Hanoch is an all-time member of Beit Daniel congregation and the head of the prayer committee, whose wife is Filipino. And Hanoch said, we became friends since all the men are Jews and the women came for a conversion course. The men became closer to Jewish religion through Beit Daniel, and now we came to Beit Daniel because it is our synagogue. Hanoch's words indicate that the close relationship formed between the couples during the conversion studies helped to turn them from consumers of conversion services into involved congregation members. By involved congregation members, I mean that Chizmi, for an example, he is the regular, Moshe Chizmi, he is the regular Torah reader during Shabbat morning prayers, regular among some others members of the congregation. In addition, his wife and her friends sing songs in their mother tongue from time to time during the Friday night services, and they participate in various volunteer projects in the congregation. Summary. Although Reform Conversion is not recognized by the Chief Rabbinate of Israel, it allows converts to be registered as Jews at the Ministry of the Interior and provides certain, if limited, recognition of for such individuals as Jews by the state. It also means that the individuals are recognized by Jews as Jews by an institutional Jewish denomination, namely the Reform Judaism, and this signaling to societies that they have tried to become part of the national collective by using the only available conversion path open to them. I have discovered that all the converts displayed the behavior patterns mentioned in the current literature on conversion in Israel and had undergone conversion by means of integrating into Jewish Israeli society. I also found out that some converts, particularly those born in the former Soviet Union, had a spiritual interest in Judaism and a desire to learn more about it, which culminated in their conversion. While the Russian-speaking women can pass for Jewish Israeli after converting because they can fix what needs to be fixed in order to be considered fully fledged Jews, despite having a non-Jewish mother, This is not the case for the Filipino women. By contrast, the dual marginality of the Filipino converts, their formal status as foreign workers and from a non-Western race, resulted in the fixed liminal identity of Filipino converts. Yet, it is precisely this dual marginality of Filipino converts together with their circle of friends, which consist of mixed couples of Israeli husband and Filipino wives, which motivates them to join the congregation and helps them gain a sense of belonging to the Israeli society. This phenomenon is in essence an alliance of marginalized groups based on overlapping interests, namely, with the help of a Jewish denomination, which is still nowadays being treated as marginal, as the other in the Israeli Jewish society, the converts, who are themselves considered to be socially marginalized, carve their own unique place in Israeli society. In addition, due to their wife's marginality, which forced them to take an alternative path to conversion, Filipino converts' husbands find ways to deepen their connection with Judaism. Most of the converts treat Ben Daniel as a service provider. A minority of them became regular congregation members. One can carefully say that the individual Ben Daniel convert's decision to keep attending it regularly stems from the scope of social connection she has made in the congregation. While most of the converts treat Ben Daniel as a service provider, a minority of them became regular congregation members, as we saw in the case of the Filipino women and their husbands. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll have the question period at the end after the response. Our next speaker is Mirjam Lucking, whom we've had fortunate to have with us is here at the Center for the Study of Conversion. She's a postdoc in Asian Studies at Hebrew University, but belonging to the center. Mirjam is an anthropologist working on mobilities and globalization, intercultural encounters, religion, in particular Islam and politics, and has developed a special interest in the relationship between Indonesia and the Middle East. Her work is informed by long-term stays in Indonesia, Morocco, and Syria, and by academic education in social and cultural anthropology, Southeast Asian studies, and Middle Eastern studies. And in the course of her fellowship here in Israel, she's researching tourism from Indonesia to Israel and to the Palestinian territories. The topic of her talk will be contemporary journeys of conversion from Indonesia to Israel.
Yeah, thank you very much. As you just said, I'm researching about pilgrimages from Indonesia to Israel and the Palestinian territories. And when people hear about that, most Israelis are very surprised. They say, why of all places you come to Israel to study about Indonesia? We have no diplomatic relationships with Indonesia. Indonesia doesn't recognize Israel as a state. It's the country that is home to the largest Muslim population in the world. So can they even come here? So it comes as a surprise to most Israelis that in fact there are a lot of Indonesians traveling to Israel, about 30,000 per year. Even though this is like only 1% in the total arrival of tourists in Israel, in guided package tourism they are the number 5. So in this particular type of guided pilgrimage tours, they are quite important. And when you talk to people working in tourism in Jerusalem, everybody is, can you teach us Bahasa Indonesia? We need more Indonesian-speaking guides. So it's something that is growing, that is relevant for tourism in Israel. And also in Indonesia, there are travel agencies popping out of the ground everywhere. And that's also how I got interested in the topic. I worked before on Mecca pilgrimages and the booming tourism to the holy sites in Mecca and Medina, and then I realized that there seems to be kind of a flow-on effect as the Christian neighbors also want to do something, a prestigious pilgrimage. So you see here in these 2 advertisements that there are Christian as well as Muslim pilgrimages. The Christian ones usually called Holy Land tours, and they start in Egypt, visit the pyramids, and then come from the south, from the Eilat border crossing, go to Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and then up to the Galilee and then they usually exit Israel through Jordan, visit Petra, and fly back home to Indonesia. And then the Muslim tours are advertised as tours to Palestine, not to Israel. In most of their advertisements you will not find the word Israel, only, like, not at all. And they also go to Egypt and Jordan and spend only 3 days in Israel, where they spend most of their time in Al-Aqsa, and then also visit Hebron and Jericho, and sometimes other tombs of Muslim saints like the Nabi Musa Mosque. That's the context. And then when I applied for this postdoc fellowship, I knew that conversion and interreligious encounters are relevant. Concerning the question about religious mobilities, I was very interested in how the physical mobility, the physical movement is related to changing religious lifestyles, because I saw that for some people, I mean, I saw that already in the Muslim pilgrimages, that to make a pilgrimage is a statement, and it's often part of a longer journey of conversion or finding one's religious identity. And until 2 weeks ago, I intended to talk more about inner Christian conversion here, and to study all of this in the context of Muslim-Christian relationships in Indonesia. But, and I have to apologize to Clara that I changed my talk a bit from the paper that I sent you. 2 weeks ago, one of the guides from Jerusalem called me and said, Mirjam, you have to come to Jerusalem because I have a Jewish group from Indonesia. So Judaism emerged more and more into the picture a while ago, but it was only 2 weeks ago that I met a group that considers itself being Jewish. So I will mostly talk about these two topics of religious mobility. I'll not talk about conversion to and from Islam, because this is like a whole other topic, and due to a lack of time I will skip that for today. Before I give you some background on the religious landscape in Indonesia, just to give you an idea, an example of how Judaism emerged into the picture, because I'm very excited by it and I think it's interesting for this audience. This Menorah Tour and Travel is one of the largest travel agencies in Indonesia, and this is not the only travel agency that uses Jewish and Israeli symbols, like the Menorah, or travel agencies called Sharon Travel or King David Tours. This is very common among charismatic Pentecostal evangelist streams of Christianity, and usually the churches also, the travel agency is attached to the church. And I mean, this is still like about Christianity, but Jewish symbols are very popular, and I'm interested in the question to what extent these symbols remain symbols that function mostly in the Indonesian context, and what they mean in the Indonesian context, or if this also goes along with changing beliefs, changing practices and rituals. So about the context, here you see another picture of an Indonesian woman in Papua, which is a peripheral region in Indonesia, saying, "I stand with Israel." And what I saw, like from my previous visits to Indonesia also, is that this is a provocation of the Muslim majority of the society that is very much supporting Palestine. That's what Indonesians often tell you with pride, that we are a poor country, we are a developing country, but Palestine, that's something where we actually do charity and we collect funds, as you can see in this picture of two women in a demonstration for Palestine. So in recent years we see that the relations between Muslim and Christian people become more tense, and it has not always been like that. But part of it is also related to the history, and I'll give you, I try to keep it brief, some insight about that. So the different religions in Indonesia, the archipelago in pre-Islamic times until the 14th century was characterized by Hindu and Buddhist influence, and there were like Hindu and Buddhist kingdoms that then began to trade with Arab traders. And through trade from Arab countries and then later also from India, Islam came into the region, and it mostly spread in the coastal regions. And that's where, until today, people speak of Islam Arab as the Islam of the coastal regions that was influenced by the Arab traders from the Arabian Peninsula. And then later in the 16th, 17th century, there came Sufi missionaries, mystics from India and Persia who went into the island of Java, where they spread another form of Islam that was more syncretic and got mixed with the Hindu-Buddhist heritage. So there is, even in the history of Islam in Indonesia, there is a differentiation between Islam Arab and what is called Islam Java, like Javanese syncretic Islam, even though today Islam Arab also means something else, as I will tell you later. And then Christianity came during colonial times to Indonesia. Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch, and also there was Portuguese presence in the context of the spice trade. And you see on this map that, I mean, the densely populated island of Java, which is like the center of political and economic power, and also large parts of Sumatra, everything that is green, is Muslim. And the Christian regions are the regions that were perceived as the so-called hinterland, like the jungle, the highlands, the areas that were hard to, that were difficult to access. And I mean, the reason for that was obviously that when people came from the Netherlands and from Portugal, they found a population that was already Islamized, and where the Muslim tradition was very strong and people were very fond of it. So the only people left to be Christianized were the indigenous people. So until today there is a combination of religious affiliation and ethnicity, and the Christian people are mainly people in the peripheries, like the blue areas that you see here, some smaller islands, then an area in North Sumatra, Sulawesi has some Christian areas, Papua, the Moluccas, and like the Moluccan Islands is also an interesting example because they're actually the Dutch privileged people who had converted to Christianity, and they are known as the collaborators of the Dutch colonial administrators, and many of them left, got asylum in the Netherlands because they fought on the side of the Dutch in the independence wars. So there has been always like Christian Muslim tensions, especially during the independence and the proclamation of the state of Indonesia. And then also later in the process of nation building and government policies, there have been conflicts because of what is known as resettlement programs. So the central government in Jakarta wanted to solve economic problems in the densely populated island of Java by resettling people to the outer islands. Like this is an example of Papua, where you see the green regions is where Javanese people have been settled, and they received subsidies and privileges by the government, and as you can imagine, there was jealousy and a feeling of invasion, Muslim invasion from Java. So especially, Papua is a special case because there has been a lot of violence, and until today the people in Papua have a very strong separatist movement and want to become independent from Indonesia. Another case of inter-ethnic and inter-religious violence is related to the history of the Chinese Indonesians. In all of Southeast Asia there is a Chinese diaspora, people that have been living there for many generations and that do consider themselves as Indonesian, but there has been a lot of violence against the ethnic Chinese, and Blake Smith, a historian, he has the theory that the Indonesians hate the Chinese because they are Jewish, and he describes how the Dutch colonial administrators worked with anti-Semitic stereotypes to try to win the confidence of the majority of the people in Indonesia, saying that the Chinese are like the Jews in Europe, they control the economy and you cannot trust them. And I mean, until today there are many conspiracy theories about Zionism in Indonesia, and usually these conspiracy theories include Chinese Indonesians. There have been riots against Chinese Indonesians, especially in 1965, and we speak of a genocide of up to 1 million people, a topic that is very little researched and that you won't find in any history book in Indonesia. So. But apart from this sad side of interreligious and interethnic relations, there's also what is called unity in diversity, and in some ethnic groups, like among the Javanese, people adhere to different religions. Like this is a Javanese ritual where you will find both Muslim and Christian and Buddhist and Hindu people who all take part in the same ritual. And this has been very much celebrated in the state philosophy of Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, Javanese for unity in diversity, promoting Indonesia as a pluralist and multi-religious, multi-ethnic country. In the large Muslim and Christian organizations, there is a thing called Contextual Theology, where theologists emphasize the rich heritage of ethnicity, and they combine Christian and Muslim theology with pre-Christian and pre-Islamic belief systems. Like this is an example of a study on Ros and Adu in a Nias island, where people combine animism with Christianity. And the traditional churches, they today face a lot of competition from the charismatic and the evangelical churches. As one of the priests from Nias recently posted this meme on Facebook saying, "Zaman dulu orang Nias saling memberi salam Yahowu," like in former times the Nias people would greet each other with Yahowu, and now they use the term shalom, or they change it with shalom, which has become a trademark of charismatic churches. And then she suggests that people should return to the meaningful, the old greeting of Yahowu. So this is what is happening in the competition between the traditional ethnic indigenous churches and the new religious movements. And I find it very remarkable that this is equivalent to the discussion in Islam, where Muslim people in Indonesia always debate about how much Arabness is part of Islam. And this is a picture of Gus Dur, who has been a president of Indonesia from 1999 to 2001. And in this quote, he says, we should not use Arab language. We should not use like ana, antum, akhi. We should use our own Indonesian language. So it's a kind of a parallel development that shalom and assalamu alaikum have become fashionable among in modern religious lifestyles, and many people say no, we should return to selamat pagi, Yahowu, horas, like the traditional Indonesian greetings. All of this happens in the context of commercialization, or what has been called spiritual entrepreneurship. The headscarf is maybe the most prominent symbol of this. There is a lot of consumptive religious lifestyles that concerns all aspects of people's life, the free time activities, going to the Quran prayer group or to the Christian like choir, and also especially for Muslim people, the fashion, the dress. And Holy Land tourism, pilgrimages to Mecca and Medina and to Israel are part of this lifestyle. As I said before, for the Muslim case, I found that this is related to social prestige and social status. People who have accomplished the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, also have the status as a Hajjah or Haji. And now the Christian people can also have that, as the Ministry of Tourism gives them a pilgrimage certificate saying that the person has completed the pilgrimage to the holy city of Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. So you see that there are ideological narratives in these pilgrimages, and that this works, there is a lot of symbolic capital involved. So my first assumption here is that the engagement with other religious traditions, in this case with Judaism, appears to be inspired by a competition between Muslim and Christian Indonesians, and it's related to social status in Indonesia, where these symbols do not only communicate religious affiliation, but also social class as part of this commercialized modern religious lifestyles in neglection of the traditional religious institutions. This assumption is supported by my observation that every part of the pilgrimages, and I accompanied many groups in the last 6 months, is documented and posted on social media. So the selfie with the soldiers or with the police and pictures with the flag of Israel, all of this is posted on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and also the very interesting traveling of symbols is what I found Beitar Yerushalayim jersey, where when I talked to this priest who is wearing the jersey, and this is by the way in Bethlehem where people were not amused by this at all, is that he did not know much about the ideological credentials of Beitar Yerushalayim, which now also changed its name in Beitar Trump Yerushalayim. But he said, well, you know, it's just, it's very fitting to the name of our travel agency, Menorah Tours and Travel. It also has the menorah, it has the same colors. So, from my observations, I got the impression that most of the engagement with Zionist or Israeli or Jewish symbols is directed to an audience at home and to what Christian Indonesians want to communicate in the home context. In some cases, this is related to a longer journey of conversion, as most of these groups who have a liking for Jewish and Israeli symbols are the charismatic churches, who compete with the traditional churches, and the most prominent example of this is the concept of being born again. So in my interviews with the people, I learned that, yeah, they had been a member of another church before, but finally they had found the truth and they had met Jesus, and it was very important to see the actual places. And while travel agencies and guides in Jerusalem say this is just a marketing strategy of the churches in Indonesia, they put people under pressure to come here. From my interviews, I can say that many people gave testimonies. They used the long bus rides from the Galilee to Jerusalem, between Jericho and Bethlehem, to give testimonies about how they had met Jesus. And it's always the hope that during their time here they will have another spiritual experience. And this is a picture of Philip Mantöfer, a very famous televangelist from a large city in Indonesia, from Surabaya, who baptizes people who have become new members of Pentecostal movements. But again, this is related to the inner Indonesian context, and the pilgrimage, the travel to Israel, seems to be just a new arena or a new area where people can explore their conversion, but it's a traveling microcosmos. Everything is concentrated on with whom do I travel, who's the Indonesian priest that accompanies me, who are my fellow pilgrims, and what does it mean when I come back to my congregation in Indonesia. As the guides in Jerusalem say from their experience, for Indonesian people it's important to feel, touch and see. It's the spiritual experience that they are looking for, and it's not so much any historical or theological background. This also, in the context of competition, leads to the fact that this search for spiritual experience is very additive. Guides in Jerusalem say that from other countries you could usually tell which one is a Protestant group, which one is a Catholic group. Like the Catholics, they will go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Protestants will go to the Garden Tomb. For Indonesian pilgrims, they want to have everything because they don't want to miss out. And wherever they see a new opportunity to have some kind of sensual experience, they will go there. So this also means that there is an invention of new rituals and pilgrimage sites, the travel agencies recount that because they always have to offer something new to their customers in Indonesia, they have to look for new sites. Like now in Canaan, many people do the commemoration of the wedding vow, or in the baptism is something that also people who have been baptized before, they will find a reason to have another ritual and another baptism ceremony. And also some guides say that now they face difficulties to discover new pilgrimage sites, because the pilgrims, they compare with other pilgrims and they want to have a bit more of a spiritual experience. So what I found on this additive or consumptive lifestyle fits with what Jonathan Gies and others call religious boutinage. So they say it's not so much conversion, they are not converts, they are more travelers. It's not a conversion in this case, doesn't have a clear starting point and a clear end point, but it's an ongoing circle of a consumptive attitude in this context of new religious movements, of Pentecostalism and evangelist churches that compete very much and that always try to offer something new to their followers, who often move from one church to the other and so on. Just because I found this only 2 weeks ago, and I think it's very interesting, the Messianic movements. It seems that in the search of offering new places, now Jewish places also became interesting. And many tour guides in Jerusalem confirm that, we also visit sites like King David's tomb is an example. It's like a multi-religious pilgrimage site, but it becomes more interesting. And it seems that because they want to search and offer something new, Judaism becomes a thing. I looked a bit into this when I first heard about it, and I found that in Indonesia there is a movement called Sacred Namers, and it started with the discussion about the use of the term Allah. Like in Bahasa Indonesia, in Indonesian language, a lot of the vocabulary comes from Arabic, and the word for God is also a word that comes from Arabic, like many other words. And in the Indonesian Bible translation, the word for God is Allah. But then in the early 2000s, there was a discussion that Allah is an Arab term and it's the God of the Muslim people. We should not use it. And actually, this was a similar discussion in Malaysia. And in Malaysia, in 2014, there has been a law that demands Christians to change the Malaysian Bible translation and to avoid the use of the term Allah because it's a Muslim term. And then people in Indonesia, or the Messianic movements, they started to replace it with Yahweh, Adonai, Elohim. And they also speak of Jesus as Yeshua, which they consider as the Messiahs. But they got more and more interested in Jewish traditions and were inspired by Adventist movements of the Hebrew Roots movement, the Sacred Name movement. Even though in Indonesia the Sacred Namers would not consider themselves Adventist, but they are inspired by this and they start to eat kosher and keep the Shabbat. Nevertheless, what I found about this type of Messianic Christianity, it's still in the context of religious commercialization, and they advertise it very much on Facebook and everywhere. Also here I skipped this is an example of how they use Hebrew language in their own prayers, and they opened 2 synagogues in North Sulawesi, and some of them try to trace Jewish ancestry from Dutch or Portuguese colonial administrators. There has been a little bit of research about it by Theo Kamsma, but I think there remain a lot of open questions here, and that's maybe the historians can give me some insights about the Dutch and Portuguese Jews in colonial times, mixed couples, and lost tribes, what the Messianic movements in Indonesia are now looking for. In conclusion, for me, it remains the question how much of this happens because of the growing tensions between Muslim and Christian Indonesians, where the affiliation with Judaism or the solidarity with Israel, as you can see here in another picture from Papua, where you find a lot of Israeli flags, it's hardening, it's strengthening the boundaries between Muslim and Christian Indonesians. So does this happen because of growing Islamophobia, or is it something that is provoked by the inner Christian competition, the competition between the traditional churches and the new churches, where the boundaries are blurred? It's not clear in this boutinage of traveling around, like denominations mix, and also the boundaries between Christianity and Judaism mix. And just to conclude, like the group, when 2 weeks ago this guide from Jerusalem called me, I met this Jewish group in Jerusalem. They came especially because of Shavuot. They wanted to have a Jewish celebration in a Jewish environment, saying that they have been practicing Jewish rituals for 12 years now, and they had never been to Israel. This was their first visit in Israel. And I met them in a synagogue of a Reformed Jewish tradition. They visited the tomb of Rachel, the Machpelah, the Patriarch's cave in Hebron, and they did not enter a single church. So this is something where my previous assumption and what I intended to talk about today got challenged a bit, because this doesn't fit in the picture anymore. This doesn't seem to be only the communication of boundaries within Indonesia, but there seems to be something where people really change and embrace new religious practices. And I think on this I should end. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Some of you may know that in Israel there's no dearth of holy places. They're being discovered on a regular basis. Graves of prophets who have been dead for thousands of years have suddenly been discovered. And so if your tourists are looking for new places, we can provide them. The next speaker is Hilda Nissimi, is a senior lecturer and chair of the General History Department at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. Research on the Mashadi community concentrate on memory as a major factor in the formation of the community's identity in its various diasporas and migrations, and was published in various articles in her book, The Crypto-Jewish Mashadis, The Shaping of Religious and Communal Identity in Their Journey from Iran to New York. Lately, she is interested in the presentation of Jewish identity in museums and has published several articles. Her latest, The National Rhetoric of the Israel Museum, Jewishness and Israeliness. The research is in Israeli independence, and she'll be talking about the conversion of Joseph Wolf, missionary imperialist Englishman.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm going to take you to a different time and a different place. And although, and it's not going to be the land of Israel, although I will touch base, I will be my traveler rather, will also be in the land of Israel. Can I have some light here? Thank you. So my traveler will come to the land of Israel at some point, but that is not going to be the central part of his. Is it okay? Thank you. Okay? Okay, so travel and conversion are going to be very central for the identity politics of my hero as well. Thank you. I'm going to restart so that you won't need to be very. So I'm going to talk about Joseph Wolf, one of the most distinguished converted Jews who served as clergyman in the Anglican Church in the 19th century in England. Wolf was born in Bavaria in 1795, the son of a Jewish rabbi, but at the age of 18 he became a Catholic monk. At 24, he enrolled as an Anglican missionary to the Jews in London, in Britain. Soon afterwards, he started his missionary journeys, in fact, without actually finishing his studies. His travels were extensive between 1821 to 1836, 1828 to 1834, 1836 to 1838, and then after a short stay in England in 1843 to 1845. He went out on his travels again. This time it wasn't a missionary expedition. He was looking or helping to look or hoping to find two British officers that were lost in the area. The government believed that they were dead already. He believed that he could find them alive. And he thought that he knew best because he knew the area better than anyone else. And the area was northern Iran and Bukhara. And he visited, among other places, the United States, Greece, Malta, Crimea, the land of Israel, Palestine as it was then, Egypt, Abyssinia, Yemen, Turkey, Central Asia in general, and India, and I must have left off a few others. But this paper focuses on the convergence of Wolff's Jewishness and Englishness. His Englishness was based on his claim to Jewishness, so his conversion is very central to this identity politics, and to the support to the English Empire, and this is how his travels come in. So these two are very important in providing this new identity of him as an Englishman. Wolff is a fascinating example of how a sense of belonging can be fashioned and by an individual through his personal interpretation of a public discourse, in this case of both Englishness and Jewishness, and his participation in that discourse. So my talk is going to be divided generally into three parts. The first part and the longer one is about his missionary expeditions and how his participation in the mission to convert the Jews was a central part in his claim to Englishness. The second part is going to deal with his claim as his contribution to the advancement of the British Empire. And the third part is going to see how this was accepted, how much of an Englishman he actually became through these two contributions in his eyes to Englishness. So, to the first part, as a missionary. Wolff identified himself as a Jew even after his conversion and during all his missionary travels. He always showed an ethnic affinity to Jews. His first missionary trip to Bukhara was declared to be, in part, a search for the lost 10 tribes. His search was influenced, as most of these searches in the 19th century was, by the advancement of both geographical knowledge and the advent of colonialism, and it was a mutual movement. I mean, the travels contributed to colonialism, and colonialism contributed to this search. For Wolff, the search was also tied to his Jewish roots. He closely linked the value of his Jewishness to his commitment to spreading Christianity. He, in his book, which is mentioned here, which is actually a sort of memoir that he published shortly before his death in 1861, he wrote in the preface that his object in his travels, in his writings, was not only advancing his new religion, namely Christianity, but also showing pride in his ethnic Jewish origins. To the Jewish nation, he is going to show that he is not ashamed of confessing to the world that he is of the seed of Abraham, of the Semitic race, which has given light, the light of knowledge of God, as if knowledge of God as it is in Christ Jesus, and the light of civilization to the world. Thereby, by this expression of Jewish superiority, but not exactly Jewish religion, I would try to claim that he is actually claiming an ethnic superiority. He's not the only one at the time. We have Disraeli, a much better known person to do something similar. But he is attributing it to Christianity. When asked by Horatio Walpole III, Earl of Orford, about his family, he was asking for his sister's hand in marriage. Wolfe claimed none other than Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as his ancestors. He told the Jews in Argostoli, "I am your brother according to the flesh." Now, I'm aware of the fact that these could be Christian sayings as well as Jewish, but he is also claiming on another incident that someone has told him, some lady has told him that he looks very much like the son of a Christian nobleman, and he left in anger because that was, in a way, insulting to him. He was Jewish. He wasn't a son of any noble. Wolfe repeatedly told his readers that he was accepted everywhere as a Jew. To emphasize their acceptance, he reported that the Jews could not believe he was a convert. On the other hand, he considered any denial of his Jewishness as grounded in ill will. He consoled himself that it was not his conversion that estranged them from him, but their ingratitude. After all, even Sir Moses Montefiore himself, although a strict Jew and burning with love for the Jews, has met with ingratitude from his nation. Wolfe showed special, he is funny in more ways than one. Wolfe showed special empathy towards Jews who resisted conversion and adhered to their Jewishness. He presented a consistent objection to forced conversion of the Jews. For him, true Christianity was recognizable in its objection to forced conversion of Jews, but he explained the plight of Jews on a Christian theological basis. "I love the Jews, and am grieved when I see them persecuted by nominal Christians. But I know that the Jews are now dispersed on account of their unbelief." But he went beyond theodicy and claimed to have intervened on their behalf. His letter on behalf of the Greek Jews, he was in Greece at the time, for full civil rights was a mishmash of missionary messianic promises, an attempt to exercise power leverage of the English involvement, with a touch of anti-Semitic views on Jewish degradation. On the other hand, he had little to say on a similar dispute at the same time about civil rights to the Jews in England. His lack of support was strikingly different from that of another Jewish convert of the time, Moses Margoliouth, who actually openly championed the bill for Jewish civil rights in England. In this matter, as in many others, Wolfe was close to evangelical opinions in Britain at the time. Those who supported the Jews with a view to their conversion were split between those who opposed the measure for their civil rights on the basis of preserving the Protestant character of the English nation, and those who believed that toleration of the Jews was an act of Christian charity which would induce the Jews to convert. As Ragusi said, the conversion of the Jews was an ideological paradigm that will dominate 19th century English discourse. So, Wolfe's conversion, Wolfe's work for conversion is very much within this context. Wolfe's expression of Jewishness were not without reservations. His recurrent anti-Semitic utterances, as I already mentioned about Greece, attest to the outsider element and are part of his radical assimilation, even though they never reached the point of Jewish self-hatred, as other converts in England did at the time. He recounted, for instance, just one instance of his anti-Semitic utterances. He recounted an unfounded story about Jews who put it into their heads to create a new Palestine in Cyprus, and in their fanaticism they murdered many thousands of the Gentile inhabitants, but in the end they had to surrender and they fled the island. I assume it might have some connection perhaps to Don Yosef Nassi or something, but nothing actual in history. His remarks, I think, indicate misgivings about his Jewish heritage. Wolfe's expression of his Jewish ethnicity was rarely divorced from his missionary efforts. In fact, I would actually claim that it was part of that effort. Already in 1821, Wolf's benefactor, Henry Drummond, organized the first of the Albury conferences on the millennial prophecies. Wolf, due to his Jewish origins, was accorded the special status of translator. This resonated with the accepted truth at the London Society for the Conversion of the Jews, about which we will hear more later today, that no one can so well enter into the feelings, the principles and strong prejudices of a Jew as another Jew. Wolf's Jewishness was preserved in part by the surrounding society's suspicious reaction towards converts. He was painfully aware of the double standard of the Christian world towards Jewish converts. According to Wolf, the prevailing convention was that one ought to keep down a converted Jew and not spoil him. That's Wolf speaking, of course. As David Feldman shows, it was already at the beginning of the 19th century that the discourse on identity in Britain took on a racial turn, even without connection to the Jews. But during the debate on Jewish emancipation in the 1830s, the Tory Solicitor General Edward Sugden maintained that Jews had ethnic ties that precluded them from the English nation. With the concept of brother in the flesh, Wolf took advantage of this debate as means of advancing his missionary task and his missionary credentials. Wolf's definition of Jewishness was intricately connected to his understanding of Englishness. His Jewishness was almost subservient to his missionary labors. But his writings read as a definition of Englishness as he perceived it. England for him was, and I quote, the land of energy, integrity, and piety, and the land of gentlemen, in one word, in England. The Anglican Archbishop of Dublin, Richard Whately, called him a missionary Shakespeare, though it couldn't have been his linguistic proficiency that earned him the compliment, as his command of the English language left something to be desired. Wolf saw Englishness, mission, and Protestantism blended together. Several times he quoted admiration for the Protestant religion, which he then translated to admiration for the English nation, and vice versa. In one such instance, Wolf wrote about a man who came to him and declared that he wanted to become English. Wolf translated this for his readers in parentheses as meaning Protestant. In another incident, he translated an Arabic exclamation of admiration, "Wahallah," for the distribution of food by a Protestant minister himself, to, "By God, the English are excellent people." Wolf's missionary zeal afforded him an Englishness which he otherwise would have had little claim to, as I already said. Now, let me have a look at him as the British imperialist that he tried to present himself. Wolf became the embodiment and precursor of the connection between mission and empire. According to William Thomas Gidney, the historian of the LJS, the London Society for the Conversion of the Jews, Wolf was the pioneer of this society's missions in the East. William Lewis, who had been sent by the same society, proclaimed that because of Wolf's exertions, the door is fully open for proclaiming the gospel in Jerusalem among the Jews. Yes, although in fact Wolf and the missionaries who followed him met with little success, they were part of the ongoing interest and involvement of Britain in Palestine. The Empire Project was Englishness. The inhabitants of these foreign lands were the other. Travel literature in particular is particularly amenable to the theories of cultural interaction presented in Edward Said's Orientalism. By linking his travelogues to the search of the 10 lost tribes, for instance, he endowed these countries with a mythic, unreal aura. And yet, at the same time, he was claiming to make them known and manageable, open to Europeanization through religious conversion and imperial influence. But Wolf's travels present him as the embodiment of both religion and empire. The Asiatic Journal printed a report claiming that The rumor prevailed that Mr. Wolff was the Prince Royal of England and that he had been sent by his royal father to watch the movements of the Russians and then to assist the Turkomans against them. As Marie-Louise Pratt has shown, travel writing in this era was very popular and made imperial expansion meaningful and desirable. Travel books created a sense of curiosity, excitement, adventure, and even more further, they were a key instrument in bringing the Empire project back home. So Wolff wasn't mistaken in his reading of the centrality of the connection between mission and empire to English political culture of his time. The concern for empire and for mission in the empire broadened among Anglicans already in the late 18th century, and the evangelicals joined in. The growing influence of evangelicalism provided a new impetus for missionary work and from missionary work to imperial expansion. In the mid-19th century, the spread of Christianity and British trade were expected to be mutually dependent. Wolff's missionary travels and his books describing them came just in time to play a part in this trend. According to Kenneth Scott Latourette, the 19th century was the age of the most extensive geographic spread of Christianity brought about by missionary activity and demonstrating Western influence, wealth, and power. However, the affinity between millennial theology and imperial policy, truth to be said, was far from straightforward. When Lord Palmerston embraced Lord Shaftesbury's plan for the settlement of the Jews in Palestine, he was totally aware that he was doing it on tactical, political, not strategic grounds. Strategically and internationally, these plans were hardly viable and therefore never pursued for long until the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and one could claim that not even then. The proponents of the plan were considered fanatical, eccentric, even if not entirely excluded from the political world. Andrew Porter has also written a lot about the ambivalence between mission and empire, but even he agrees that Britain's religion and Britain's empire were obviously intricately linked. So to the last part about how all this is accepted as his Englishness back home. So Wolff's concoction of empire and mission was popular, timely, but not entirely accepted by the political elite. Fame and social status were derived from his extensive travels and his reports about them. The dissemination of these stories made his name a household word and gave him prominence as an English missionary. Wolff's depiction of Englishness was accepted by and large by his audience. His highly successful acceptance in England, as at least the acceptance of his books show, was based on his web of identities, which he presented as an unorthodox admixture of ideas of Christianity, especially his attitude towards the Jews. His marriage to the sister of the Earl of Orford, I couldn't find the actual brother, so that's the grandfather, but still just to give you an impression, is probably the best proof of his acceptance, or sort of acceptance, to the Victorian elite, but so also is his area of friends among the famous, the literati and politicians, including William Gladstone, Sir Walter Scott, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Sir Charles Napier, and even Benjamin Disraeli, to whom he dedicated the book with which I started my talk. Still, his worldwide reputation, as someone called it, and his having become a household word to many people, brought no preferment on his return to England from any national establishment, only from private friends, and not too much of that either. Perhaps his Englishness was just enough to be recognized as an imperial agent, as a promoter of Protestantism, but not quite enough to be fully accepted at home. His imperial faithfulness was extolled by his readers, who rejoiced to find Dr. Wolff located among us in an English country with a truly English heart. So to conclude, Wolff participated in the contemporary discourse on Englishness and Jewishness through his travel books and his missionary travels, and labors. He posited himself as the champion of English religion and English imperialism, as their spokesman. His conversion and his preservation of Jewishness was part and parcel of his ability to play the English gentleman, but was also part of the new discourse of unbreakable Jewish ethnic ties. His self-fashioning as Englishman was based on radical assimilation. Yet it was an assimilation worn so proudly, an assimilation that mixed ethnic origins and social integration in a convergence that defies a simple dissection of the two. His Englishness he perceived as based on his Jewish origins, his definition of Jewishness he received from the imperial and Protestant discourse of his times. He made himself into an Englishman because he was so proud he was a Jew. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And after these three wonderful lectures, we have a respondent. Respondent is also from the Center for the Study of Conversion. Carla Ramos Garcia is now a doctoral student at the Boundar University. She received her second degree on Medieval and Renaissance Studies at the University of Salamanca. And she joined the research group Corpi. Many of us have been there, or connections with conversion, overlapping religiosities, polemics, and interaction at the SIC in Madrid, and also a member here of the Center for the Study of Conversion. And her doctoral thesis is being supervised by Mercedes Garcia Arenal of Madrid and Professor Claude Strudzinski, who's sitting in the back. And her research focuses on the Portuguese Jewish converts, the Nación of the early modern period, and she'll be responding to the three lectures.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the three speakers for three wonderful presentations from which I have learned a lot. Though it has become clear I'm coming from a different period, my research focuses on something completely different, but at the same time I have seen on your text many of the concerns and topics I'm working on. Actually, not only me, but all of us who are working on conversion and the problems that arise when we try to explain in which way individual and collective identity changes after a conversion process. Or even more, how we critically analyze the way the convert defines himself or how the surrounding group accept that definition. In this way, I found three relevant terms, each one in each of your papers, that I think are present in all your talks because they are, at the end, an inherent part of conversion. And those words are self-fashioning, mentioned by Professor Hilda Nissimi, liminality, used by Dr. Einat Libel-Hass, and negotiation, mentioned by Dr. Mirjam Lucking, at least in your first one. So, in the case of Joseph Wolf, Nissimi had clearly presented how his attempt to build himself, his attempt to build a discourse which situated him at the core of the English society was a tenacious objective of his missionary actions. I think Wolf is a clear example of how self-fashioning is limited by a fruitless negotiation with the group he intended to enter. When I was reading your paper, I immediately remembered Alonso de Cartagena, a figure who, although very far from gold in time and space, he confronted the same problem of placing himself as a convert inside a national discourse that excluded him as an Christian. And I found very interesting that rereading the fantastic article on Cartagena written by Rosenstock, in which he explains the writings of the convert following post-colonial theories, there were important parallelisms between both personalities. They were both converts from Judaism, and both tried to put this Jewish background in a national discourse using a characteristic strategy of the marginal writer. Reconfigure the science through which the nation is constituted and produces a hybrid representation of national identity which at once renews the nation and unsettles it. In order to do that, Cartagena, and I think Joseph Wolf as well, took advantage of the slippage between the image of the nation's organic and unbroken connection to its past and the equally significant image of the nation as coming into being through a decision of the collective will to a deliberate act of self-creation. At the end, both attempts of marginal writing were unfulfilled as long as the official nation finally stigmatized hybridism, rejecting the hybrid representation of national identity. Another interesting comparison was the one made by Dr. Einat Libel-Hass in her paper, in which he explains two different convert groups in order to see how they affronted their particular assimilation coming from different backgrounds. Here again, we can see how an unsuccessful negotiation among groups resulted in an unsuccessful assimilation, and therefore the status of linearity became permanent. You will observe the importance of the building community and the alliance of marginalized groups, and I would like to remark on another two basic ideas that, in my opinion, could be highlighted in order to understand the pressure both groups, Russian and Philippine women, confront until they convert. The first one is that this conversion is made in a particular political and social context, like a Jewish state that gives endless advantages to its Jewish immigrants. For that reason, I don't think it would be strange that part of the conversions which take part in Israel would be motivated just and only for practical reasons. Conversion as a tool of getting social, economic, or political benefits is nothing new, though it's hard to find testimonies that admit that reality. Now, as 4 centuries ago, the confession of this kind of conversion can have real consequences on real people's lives. Because I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not sure how the interaction with a real subject could be, but it seems to me that the interviewees were actually negotiating with you, and thus the insistence on the religious transformation of both groups. I'm not saying, of course, that spiritual conversions do not exist, but I wonder how the number of converts would change if we were not in Israel, or how the answer would be different outside the country, or once they are firmly established here. The second idea is related to a gender perspective. It grabbed my attention that the majority of the Philippine women you interviewed were married to men who came from an Orthodox context, and I wonder how this influences in their wives' decision of converting. A few weeks ago, Haaretz published a report of the documentary Hebrew Kisses made by Manja Losovskaya, a Russian woman who wasn't halachically Jewish and who converted. In her work, she showed her relation with her partner, who is a non-Orthodox Jewish Israeli. I immediately remember your presentation because the woman confirmed there how her conversion was the result of her partner's pressure. And I'm quoting, "I realized that the whole thing was purely bureaucratic with nothing behind it. It's true, I learned some praise by heart and spent some time in a religious atmosphere. But I believe I'm the same person I was before." End of the quote. I thought it was interesting to take this into account because the fact of being non-Jewish and a woman in the context of the Jewish state and the Jewish religion leaves little space for the identity negotiation to a group that, as you well said, has not a lot of options for being part of the national collectivity. The presentation of Dr. Mirjam Lucking deals as well with national narratives in a context of religious and political conflict, where, as you said, the identity definitions must be unequivocal. It's even more interesting to track this conflict abroad and how it mixes with the interests of the new charismatic churches, and how these new religious brands demand to be heard in the political context. And related to this, I would like to ask you if you consider this movement you talk about, Sacred Ramos, is a result of this local political conflict or of an international phenomenon. It's also interesting how their own conflict shapes the understanding of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I wanted to ask you, what is the narrative within the polarization of the local conflict of the pilgrimage trips in the case of the traditional churches, if they embrace as well a Zionist position on how, and how they define or explain the existence of an important and traditional Christian Palestinian community. To conclude, Stephen Greenblatt used the term self-fashioning to describe the process of constructing one's identity following a set of socially acceptable standards, and the conscious effort to strive to imitate a praise model in society. But this process, done without an effective negotiation with the majority group, diverts into a sense of not belonging, which can be permanent. These representations have shown different examples dealing in one way or another with these three different categories. So thank you again.
Okay, thank you. I think what we'll do is let each speaker respond to the response, and then we'll open for questions.
If I understood correctly, Carla, you spoke about the difference between Reform and Orthodox conversion. Yeah? Because when I spoke with Russian immigrants, those immigrants, some of them are, went through a Reform conversion after many years in Israel. I mean, after they are more established in the society, after they have a profession, a house. So for these particular individuals, women, the pressure of the husband wasn't the incentive to go through a conversion. Like for them, the conversion just completed the picture. And it was, from what I observed, it was a willingness to and a wish to transform themselves religiously. I mean, it was a religious transformation for them. Lena's husband actually didn't want to go through the Orthodox conversion. He refused to go through a circumcision. And because of that, she wasn't able to go through the Orthodox conversion, and then she went to the Reform conversion. So it's different from the woman that you quoted from Haaretz, if I understood correctly. And for the Philippines, the husbands, some of them are Mizrahi Jews from Orthodox families, but because they saw that their wives went through a lot of obstacles in order to get into the Orthodox conversion, they encouraged them to go to the only open way they had to go through conversion, which is Reform. And in some cases, I think that the women themselves wanted to go for a conversion, not just in order to feel part of the Israeli society, but also because they grew up in religious families. Like I sometimes think they transplanted their religious identity or practices from the Christian churches into the Reform congregation. You can speak maybe about their childhood habitus, that they felt the need in their current lives to be part of a congregation. And yes, especially for the Filipino women, they also wish to feel part of the society, and also their husbands play a great role in their decision to go for conversion. And of course, it's completely different from the Russian-speaking converts. Also because the Filipino women and their husbands stay as members in the Reform congregation, and fully fledged members, and they keep on going to the congregation Friday after Friday. But the Russian-speaking converts do not usually come back to the synagogue after they finish the conversion process. So you were right, there are two different groups. Thank you very much.
Yeah, also from my side, thank you very much for your useful comments. About the sacred namers, so I think it's both. It's inspired by or triggered by the political conflict, and also an international phenomenon. I would go even a step further, and I mean, apart from the conflict, it's also this environment of commercialized religious lifestyles, where many people say that in democratic Indonesia, like after the transition from autocracy to democracy in the last 10-15 years, Islamization and the halal fashion is the most significant social change in Indonesia. And for many people to wear a headscarf, to engage with halal lifestyle, means to be modern and hip and urban. And I wonder to what extent the Christian interest in Jewish symbolism is like a parallel movement, because obviously the Christian people have no access to the social capital of halal Muslim lifestyles. So maybe this is something, it's not an open conflict, it's more like an interreligious competition. But then concerning the conflict, definitely. Like when I asked one of the priests why he likes the Zionist symbols so much, he said, you know, every time a Palestinian gets shot, a church in Indonesia will burn. Because people in Indonesia would associate Christianity with Zionism. It's always the question what comes first, but that was what he said, why they are a bit more pro-Israel. And in fact, I don't know if this was in the media in Israel, but this time the churches actually burned before the Palestinians got shot on the 13th of May, one day before the opening of the US embassy. And I received many messages from my research participants saying, see what's happening in Indonesia again, they burn our churches. And there were 3 churches in Surabaya were attacked by Muslim terrorists. And a day later there was a video of one of the convoys in Papua with Israeli flags, where again Muslim people evoked this narrative of Zionist conspiracy, saying, see, in Palestine the people get shot and here the people celebrate it and support Israel. So I think this, I mean, it's also related to the internationalization of these narratives. And I think from what I see from the last, from my experiences of researching in Indonesia for the last 10 years, is that Islamophobia became more and more relevant, and people feel the need to position themselves to it. And for some people, the solution is to engage in pan-Muslim terrorist hardline movement, which is growing in Indonesia. But then also on the other side, there are many Muslim people in Indonesia who oppose that. And that leads me to the answer of the second question, like how do the traditional religious institutions engage with the Israel-Palestine conflict? Not only the traditional churches, but also the traditional Muslim organizations, they have another narrative. They have this narrative of we have to be proud of our indigenous traditions. And what many of my Muslim research participants say is a joke, that they say, we were always wondering why God sent all his prophets to the Middle East and not to Indonesia. Are we so unimportant, or why do we not have a prophet? And then they say, yeah, but you know, seeing the news, it's obviously that the people in the Middle East, they are also harsh and violent, so they needed the prophets to tell them how to behave better, whereas whereas the Asian people are already soft and humble and well-behaved. So that's another narrative where people do not engage in this, they do not take sides. And I rushed a bit through it, but it was the picture that I showed of the Javanese people having a ritual together and trying to emphasize that there is a joint Indonesian traditional heritage, And for them, ethnicity or traditional worldviews are more important than the religious affiliation. And this is a conflict at the moment also, not only between Christian and Muslim people in Indonesia, but also between the traditional religious organizations and the new religious movements, like both the Salafist movements and the charismatic evangelist Pentecostal movements. For the churches, actually some of the traditional churches, they boycott pilgrimages to Israel, and they denounce it as a money-making, and they warn their members of their congregations not to go with the Holy Land travel agencies. And they promote local pilgrimage sites in Indonesia. For the reference to Palestinian Christianity, there is hardly any reference, and that's also, talking to Palestinian tour guides in Bethlehem, they are very frustrated about that. They say the Christians from Indonesia, they are ignorant, they engage more with the Jews in the region than with the Christian people. They know nothing about the Arab tradition of Christianity. It's ridiculous that they don't want to use the word Allah. We use it all the time, and they step out of the bus and greet us with shalom, and they think we like it because we're Christian, but we don't. So, but that's something where Indonesian Christians do not know much about Palestinian Christianity. Yeah.
So thank you very much for your very helpful remarks from me as well, especially about what you said about the negotiation of identity of converts. And the fact that despite the fact that they're self-fashioning and they're negotiating their identity within the discourse of the majority and of the nation, they still stay liminal. They still stay on the almost outside the nation. And I thought that was rather interesting, especially since there are very special research, very central researchers like Tony Kushner and Todd Endelman, who claim that converts in England stayed liminal. They were treated as Jews and not as converts so much. Although at least one rather interesting testimony by George Bernard Shaw shows that he hated Jews, but he rather liked converts. So you have both things, and one very important difference, I think, is that their children were integrated, and including Wolf's son, Henry Drummond Wolf. He was completely within the British society. In fact, so much so, he would say that Wolf complained in a letter to Disraeli that his son asked him to leave his name out of his memoirs so that people wouldn't know that he had a Jewish extension. Wow. And so you could integrate. It's not like of course, not like the converts in Spain. So liminality, yes, but there is integration. Thank you.
Okay, we'll open it up now for questions, comments. I just ask people, A, introduce themselves, and B, speak Latin. So,
yes.
You've already been introduced.
Dov Kuczynski from Bar-Ilan University and board member of the ICOR group. Just to Mirjam, just a small detail, but for me it's important. Let's speak now not only about Islamophobia, but at the same time of Christianophobia. Mm-hmm. And it's very for the fairness of the discourse. And what it is amazing here is that for reasons of mainly of inter-religious relationships, there are a group of evangelical Christians who are becoming more and more Jewish and Israelis. In Europe, for instance, this makes many assimilated Jews to embrace Judaism and even to immigrating to Israel, because among us of these kind of conflicts, mainly but not only with the Muslim population in different parts in Europe. Then my question, if you know if already there are some Indonesian Christians who are embracing Judaism, that is official Orthodox Judaism. It will be like a self-fulfilling prophecy situation. And Hilda, I firmly believe, almost like with Hannah Arendt, that for modern, acculturated or assimilated Jew, European imperialism was a fantastic opportunity to be part of the national identity through expansion and the inclusion of, of different cultures. And here it plays also the Bible and the so-called Judeo-Christian alliance, through which the Jews, whether baptized or not, they can claim we are part, we're at the root of this moment of imperial Judeo-Christian expansion into the world. Then the examples you gave concerning the Englishness, we can find in different variations in France with Adolphe Crémieux, and in Italy when the Jews participated in Libya and in Ethiopia, Abyssinia during Mussolini's time, and so on and so forth.
I would just add also in the Baghdadi Jews in the East
followed in English imperialism.
Thank you very much, Dov. That's Christianophobia is a very important point, and I will follow that up. So, as far as I know, there is no group of Jews in Indonesia that officially converted. The two synagogues that I mentioned is synagogues of this Sacred Namers movement, who call themselves Messianic Jews, but they also acknowledge who they call Yeshua as the Messiahs, and they have like Christian practices. There seem to be some people who really want to convert and who seem to have struggles to do that, because there is no like religious authority in Indonesia with whom they could convert. And like some of the, I didn't meet them personally, but some of the tour guides in Jerusalem said that they had requests of groups in Indonesia who wanted to meet Orthodox officials in Israel, and so far it didn't work. That's also the people who say, but we are really Jewish, like we have Jewish ancestors, claiming that there has been like Portuguese and Dutch ancestors. This last group that I mentioned is really a group that is giving me a riddle, because it's very different from everything else that I've seen. So far, also the groups who call themselves Messianic are very much engaged in this performative pilgrimage, and they document the whole journey on social media. And that was one of the most significant differences with the last group, because they didn't take many pictures. They don't have a internet website, they don't have a Facebook page, so it doesn't seem to be in the context of this communicating boundaries. For them it was, and they said that they have been studying Judaism for the last 12 years, they prayed in Hebrew, they didn't enter a single church, but also for them, I asked them, so what would you call yourself? Would you call yourself Jewish or Christian? And they said, no, but we're definitely not Christian, but we cannot say that we are Jewish because we are somewhere on the way. So that's the answer they gave me, and as far as I know, there is no official Orthodox community.
Thank you, and thank you, Dov. Well, to some part, perhaps to a great part, I agree with you, but it has to be taken with a grain of salt, and I'll explain. I agree with you so much in the sense that if you know about the paradigm of the poor Jew that allowed Jews in the early modern period through their work as merchants, through their residence in port cities, to become important enough to receive certain civil rights much earlier than other Jews. I think the empire changes that and gives them a different opportunity, as poor Jews isn't quite so important anymore, but the empire is. So I think the empire building project is an opportunity for Jews to take part in the national discourse. So where do I think the grain of salt should come in? Well, not all empires, right? I mean, look at the Russian Empire, and I don't think it works. Look at the Ottoman Empire, and I don't think it works, not in the modern period anymore. And furthermore, although there is no institutional anti-Semitism in Britain, right? But there is nothing according to the law that differentiates between Jews and others after the mid-19th century. There is a lot of social anti-Semitism in Britain. So you could become very important for the British Empire as long as you stayed in the empire. But when you came back to Britain, you were a Jew as any other Jew, right? It didn't make that much of a difference if you were a Rothschild or a Sassoon or whatever. You were a Jew nonetheless, or Montefiore for that matter. So you received social acceptance, but up to a point. And if you take Disraeli as an example, with all his imperialism, or perhaps even because of his imperialism, he was Disraeli the Jew, although he was converted at the age of 13. So I think it's complicated. The empire is very important to take part in the national discourse, but from afar.
Hilda, my name is Chaim. I'd like to ask Hilda a couple of questions. I read Wolf once, and I read it after having an altercation with Bishop Montefiore. I met him, believe it or not, the Israeli embassy in London when his grandfather appeared on the 50 shekel things. I was a student. Alan, his cousin, was my tutor at Oxford, or my supervisor at the time, and he got us an invitation. We went there, and trying to be a clever Jewish boy, I went up to him and said, "How come a clever Jewish boy like you becomes a bishop?" And he answered me, "Because I wanted to become a better Jew." And then he started on, and he started to talk about Joseph Wolf, and so he actually did, and I actually got hold of the book from the library, and I read it, and this theme is also there in some of the, and I, you know, I don't know how so. I then happened to mention this to Isaiah Berlin, and Isaiah surprisingly did not like the man at all. Surprisingly. Did not like the man at all, and he said, you know, it's the worst type, and or the way we would say, terrible man, and he didn't like him. He didn't like him at all. And I always found it difficult to find out why why. But the question that I want to ask you is, how far do you think he took this seriously? That he actually believed that one could only be a better Jew by becoming a Christian?
Well, thank you. On my first encounter with Wolf, I also thought that he was the most terrible kind. It was only on the second encounter that I thought he was also very interesting. And one of the reasons I found him so interesting is I couldn't tell when he was lying and when he was telling the truth. I mean, I wouldn't know. He wasn't the only one. There were Hebrew Christians at the time, And Disraeli was claiming something very similar to what he is claiming about the superiority, the ethnic superiority of Jews, while he was claiming to be a very devout Christian, and he was going through the motions of Christianity. I mean, he was a conservative. He had to be a Christian, right? An Anglican to the point. So I wouldn't know how far it was real, how far it was part of his missionary strategies, but I do find it very funny in a historical sense of the fact that Montefiore's descendant is claiming Wolff as his teacher. I think that's Wolff sitting up there, wherever he is, and laughing his head off, I think.
By the way, in the,
he's a subject of many short stories in Yiddish literature.
Wolff?
Yes, you can read Ther, and there's others, but we'll talk about that later.
Okay.
Orly Moore is also introduced earlier.
Yeah, I'm Ora. It's a remark that has to do with all four speakers. I think the name of this panel was, this session was Conversion and Construction of Identity, but at the same time it could have been called Conversion and Travel, because in all talks, travel is very, less with you, but all your converts are travelers in a way, or traveled once. But in the other two talks, we can see this very strong linkage between travel and conversion, either as a consequence of conversion, as in Joseph Wolff, or as in the process of some kind of conversion with the Indonesian travelers. So I don't think the question is how much is it a true pilgrimage to conversion, but the very fact that some kind of adventure and of experience can be achieved only elsewhere, and also through travel, has much to do with the phenomenon of conversion, and maybe we should think about it a little bit more.
If I may comment about it, Wolff is actually a traveler before he converts. He is telling, again, truth or lie, that he was a young child when he started his travels towards conversion. He tried to convert, nobody wanted to convert him because he was too young, and until he was 18, and then someone took pity on him and actually converted him. But he was going through Europe, traveling, looking for true Christianity. So travel is very, very important in Wolff's conversion. And yes, I think travel is very important for formation of identity in general.
Yeah, I agree that some experiences need like another space, and that the negotiation of identity can take other forms, like in ritual theory when people go into this liminality. But I also think that in the case of Indonesians, it is a marketing strategy, and it is something that from my interviews I heard that sometimes people also feel under pressure to do that pilgrimage because it's prestigious to do it, and some people take on debt to do it. In other regions in Indonesia, for example in Papua, this separatist region, the government is also paying for it, so it's ensuring the loyalty of the people. So I think it's also commercialized and politicized in this case, but nevertheless everybody claims that it's related to the search of authenticity, and still when people come here they are very touched, and it definitely does something with them to be here.
Thank you. You are right, of course, Ora. If we speak about travel as a immigration to Israel, or foreign workers, or people who were originally foreign workers and then came to Israel. There is a lot of writings in the last few years about migration and its connection to conversion and to spirituality. So that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question for Einat.
Introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Olga Kirschbaum. I'm a postdoc at Bar-Ilan. And my question is about the 5% who are not women. So I don't know if it's half a man or, but if you could...
completely men.
Right, so I'm just joking. But if you could tell us a little bit about who such a person is, or who the men are in this congregation. That was my first question. And the second one was if we're going to hear from another speaker about a Filipino Orthodox community. Just wanted to know a little bit more about the age, generation, whether these women tend to be older or younger, the Filipina, if there's an issue of whether they are going to conceive children or not, or what other questions kind of come into the choice of pursuing a reform rather than an Orthodox conversion for these women and their connection with Filipino women who have converted Orthodox.
Okay, you have actually 3 questions, so I will try to answer all of them. First, about the men. I did a very long-term ethnographic fieldwork. Like I observed this congregation for more than 7 years, you can say, and I saw only few men, like you can count them on one hand. Some of them are foreign workers who married Israeli women. I remember one man, but really most of the converts are women. And about the Filipino women, their ages are 40, 50, most of them. And the reason for going for a conversion isn't for the kids that are going to come, because they don't have, most of them don't have kids after being married to Israeli partners. Most of the partners, if you saw from the pictures, are older than them. So the kids aren't a factor in the decision to go for a conversion, but more willing to feel part of the Israeli society, also to feel part of the Jewish religion. And you ask if they know about the Orthodox women who go, about Orthodox conversion for Filipino women. Well, I haven't met personally Filipino women who went for this Orthodox conversion, but the women I spoke with and a lot of their friends, they tried to go for Orthodox conversion, and actually one woman is telling the other, and then it's spread like a rumor about all the difficulties that the Orthodox establishment put in their way to go through a conversion. And because of those rumors, and sometimes because of their own experiences, they are not going to go through the conversion process. And also we should remember that the conversion courses, and this is true also for Reform conversion and Orthodox conversion, it also meaning that the husbands need to go through a conversion courses, and some of the husbands doesn't want to go through Orthodox conversion. So even when the women do want to go through the Orthodox conversion, sometimes it's the husbands, like it's something to go with the partnership itself. And in Beit Daniel, the men found their places. The men who were raised in Orthodox families, they felt part of the conversion process. They found their own connection to Judaism, although it's now in a Reform space. Thank you very much for the comments.
Yeah, I think we can do without the mic. I have a question
But now,
for...
how you're introducing yourself.
Okay, Gidon Elazar from the center. A question for Hilda. If I recall correctly, in Aryeh Morgenstern's recent book, Hashiva Yerushalayim, he speaks about Wolf and about his presence here in Jerusalem. And it's interesting that he says that actually Wolf was able to establish good relations with some of the students of Agra, with Menachem Mendel Mishklov, and some of the very surprisingly, the other Jews would not have any connection with him, but surprisingly, with some of the students of the Gaon of Vilna, he had cordial relations, and the way he tries to explain it is by the fact that they identified him as, and maybe identified himself as, a agent of British Empire, and they saw him as a possible protection, or maybe even as part of their own messianic project. So I thought it's interesting that there's a convergence here of interests of empire, but also of religious, and I'm assuming, I don't know, maybe you can say more, that he presented himself as such, as somebody who could provide some sort of protection for the Jews here, or in the Ottoman situation.
I'm sorry, I didn't see that. I didn't see Stern's book. I know about it, but I didn't look for Wolf in it. And it's very interesting, and I will have a look at it now. It's intriguing. It's especially intriguing because it works very well with other stories that Wolf himself tells about, that wherever he went, he presented himself as the British Empire in personification, that he actually, in several places, people treated him well. For instance, in one of the cases, he was very ill, and someone helped him get better, and he was very grateful for it, but they were telling him that they were doing it as in a way of, that they were actually doing it for the British Empire. So he was very good at this, and in a way it could work, because wherever he went, he made a point of staying at the British consul's house. He made a point of getting letters of recommendation from the consul to the consul. So he was in a way a personification of the British Empire wherever he went. But that was not true. I mean, he did not have any authority to do that. In some of the cases, it was quite the opposite. In the case of going in search of those lost officers, the government was quite against the whole travel, because they were sure that they were dead, and they did not want to get involved in Bukhara. And he went as a private enterprise, privately funded by people who wanted to get the empire involved in the area. So it's ambivalent a bit, his relationship with the empire.
I wanted to ask Einat, my name is Bakhen. I wanted to ask Einat about the Russian women from the former Soviet Union. Did they try to go through Orthodox conversion first, or they first went through the Reform conversion?
It's a very good, thank you. It's a very good question, because even if I spoke about the Russian-speaking women who went through conversion, actually there are a few groups inside this population. One of them are women who did try to go through a conversion, but found many obstacles in the process. So, and some of them even told me about going before the court, the rabbinical court, and then they were refused to be accepted as Jews. And then they tried again in a Reform congregation in Beit Daniel, and there is also another group in the Russian-speaking population of women who didn't try the Orthodox way, and just went straight to try the Reform option. I remember one woman whose partner was
already a member of the Reform movement, and some others who didn't want to even try the Orthodox option because all of the obstacles and the demands to keep the mitzvot for a year or more. And and of course, there are the groups inside the Russian-speaking population, the different groups. There are also differences in the ages of the women. Some of them do think about their kids or the future kids, and some of them, if they are like Lena, who was in her 50s, the kids aren't part of the equation. Like they think about themselves. So I speak in generalizations, but in reality, you can find both ways. I mean, people who want to go for the Orthodox and didn't succeed, and women who just went straight to the Reform option.
Okay, thank you.
We have time.
It's up to you. You're the boss. It's 12:30. Okay, it's 12:30. Lunch is served. Thank you very much.